In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella finished up her very first year of college and packed up her things to head home for the summer. Her family lived just outside of a small, quiet town in France that was tucked way up in the mountains and surrounded by this massive, dense forest. Growing up in this isolated area, Bella had spent a huge amount of her time out in these woods. Sometimes she went out there completely by herself, other times she went with her father, and sometimes she went with other members of her family. Because of this, she knew the forest like the back of her hand. She knew every ridge, every dense patch of trees, and every hidden clearing. But her absolute favorite place to go in this entire forest was a man-made lake that sat right at the very center of the woods. It was not a particularly massive lake, but it offered this incredibly beautiful, sweeping view of the surrounding mountains. It was very peaceful, and so whenever she needed to clear her mind, she liked to head out there. The way she would get to this lake was always the exact same. She would leave her house, hop into her car, and drive a couple of miles down the main road. Eventually, she would pull off onto the dirt shoulder of the road. Now, there was absolutely no signage indicating that this was a path or a trailhead to get to a lake. This was simply an area that she and her family had discovered on their own years ago. They had realized that if you parked right at this specific spot, there was a particular trail you could take. So, Bella would pull her car off onto the shoulder and park. She would get out, turn away from the asphalt road, and walk directly into the thick trees that grew right up against the edge of the roadway. Very quickly, after stepping into the woods and pushing her way through some dense, thorny underbrush, she would reach a small clearing and see a little stream bubbling up ahead. Off to the left side of this stream, there was what looked like a beaten-up little footpath, but actually, it was not a human path at all. It was an animal trail. Wild animals had made their way through this specific part of the forest for generations, and over time, their hooves and paws had carved out a clear path in the dirt. Bella would walk down to this animal path and follow it as it ran parallel with the stream. She would walk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes until the path veered sharply to the left, taking any travelers away from the water. At that exact point, Bella would abandon the animal path and just continue walking directly along the stream itself. She would step carefully from rock to rock, sometimes walking on the narrow dirt banks on either side of the water when she could. She would follow this stream due north, heading straight into the deep, dark heart of the forest for about an hour. She always walked at a fairly leisurely pace, enjoying the cool mountain air, until the stream finally connected with a larger river that ran from east to west. At this junction, Bella would turn left, facing west, and follow along the riverbank for about 20 minutes. Finally, the river would feed directly into the man-made lake. She would sit on a large, flat rock at the edge of the water, enjoy the beautiful view, look at the animals, and listen to the sounds of nature all around her. Then, after an hour or two of relaxing, she would turn around and retrace her steps all the way back to her car. One single leg of this journey from her car to the lake took about 2 hours. Part of the reason Bella really enjoyed being in these woods and spending time at this lake was because it felt like they belonged entirely to her. Up until that summer of 2019, the only other people Bella had ever seen anywhere in this forest or near the lake were members of her own family. It was a completely private sanctuary. So in June of that year, when Bella came home from college, she almost immediately decided she wanted to go out to the man-made lake. She had not been there in months because of her school schedule, and she was incredibly eager to get back to the place she considered her ultimate happy place. One morning, she got up early, grabbed her things, and left the house by herself. She hopped in her car, drove the couple of miles down the road, and pulled off onto the familiar dirt shoulder. She parked, hopped out, turned away from the road, and walked into the forest. She pushed through the underbrush, found the stream, and started walking along the animal path. After a few minutes, she reached the point where the trail cut to the left, so she stepped onto the rocks of the stream and kept walking north. About 30 minutes later, when she was still about 1 or 2 miles short of the east to west running river, she suddenly heard a sound. It was a bell. It came from somewhere off in the distance, way out in front of her, in the direction of the river. It sounded like a single, clear chime. As soon as she heard it, Bella stopped dead in her tracks. There were never any people out here, and yet that distinctive metallic sound had definitely come from somewhere deep in the forest. She stood perfectly still, wondering if she had actually heard it or if her mind was just playing tricks on her. She listened intently. Then she started to hear the bell ringing continuously. But the ringing was not uniform or rhythmic. It was constant but highly sporadic, as if someone was holding a bell in their hand and shaking it randomly, the way you might see someone ringing a cowbell at a sports game. Bella stood there, listening to this strange erratic sound. She began to wonder if a pet dog had gotten lost in the woods and had a bell attached to its collar. But as she listened closer, she realized the sound was far too loud and robust to be a tiny bell on a dog collar. It had to be something much larger. She started imagining strange scenarios. Had someone lost a box containing a bell, and now that box was floating down the river, crashing into rocks and making it ring? Even though these thoughts were bizarre, Bella was not scared. She was actually very intrigued. Since the sound seemed to be coming from the exact direction she was already traveling, she decided she would just keep walking. She figured she would eventually see whatever was causing the noise. Bella began walking along the stream again, keeping her ears open. But after about 5 minutes of walking, the bell suddenly stopped. The forest went completely silent. Because she had been listening to it so closely, the sudden silence actually startled her. She stopped and waited, expecting it to start up again, but nothing happened. All she could hear was the gentle rustling of leaves and the bubbling of the stream. Bella did not have an explanation for what the bell was, but she shrugged her shoulders and decided not to worry about it. She assumed there was some perfectly logical explanation. She put her focus back on reaching the lake and kept walking. About 15 minutes later, Bella was still walking along the stream. She was still maybe a mile away from the river when she noticed something up ahead on the left bank. There appeared to be a dark shape laying on the ground. At first, she could not tell if it was an animal or a large rock. As she got closer, she realized it was a beaver, but as she stood right over it, she saw something that made her stomach turn. The beaver was missing its head. Now, this was a massive forest, and Bella knew that wild animals lived and died out here all the time. Finding a dead animal that had been killed by a predator was nature. But what struck Bella as incredibly wrong was the cut on the beaver's neck. It was unbelievably neat, smooth, and uniform. It looked as if the head had been very carefully and cleanly removed with an extremely sharp knife or a scalpel. The beaver's head was nowhere to be found, and there were no jagged tears or bite marks that would indicate a predator had done this. Furthermore, the rest of the beaver's body was completely intact. Whatever had killed this animal had not eaten it. As Bella stared down at the headless beaver, she also noticed there was absolutely no smell. Normally, a dead animal begins to decompose and smell very quickly in the woods. The lack of odor meant this beaver had been killed very recently. Bella gently prodded the body with the toe of her boot and realized the limbs were still completely limp. Rigor mortis, which causes a dead body to stiffen up shortly after death, had not set in yet. This realization hit Bella like a physical blow. The beaver had died within the last hour or two. This meant that whoever or whatever had killed it was likely still very close by. Suddenly, Bella connected the dead beaver to the strange bell she had heard earlier. The sound had come from this exact area. She felt a sudden wave of unease wash over her. She began whipping her head around, scanning the dense trees and the thick undergrowth, searching for any sign of a hunter, a hiker, or anyone else who might be out there. But there was only silence and empty woods. Bella felt panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She told herself to calm down. It was broad daylight, she had been coming to these woods for years, and she had never once encountered a dangerous person or a predatory animal. She stepped over the headless beaver and continued on her way. Eventually, she reached the river, turned left, and walked the remaining 20 minutes to the man-made lake. She sat on her favorite rock, looked at the water, and tried to relax. After a while, she turned around, retraced her steps past the dead beaver, and walked back to her car. She drove home and did her best to forget about the strange day. A week later, Bella was sitting around her house feeling incredibly bored. It was a warm summer evening, and she decided quite abruptly that she wanted to go back to the man-made lake. It was her happy place, and she felt like a quick hike would cure her boredom. She told her parents where she was going, grabbed her car keys, and left the house. She arrived at the pull-off, parked her car, and entered the woods at exactly 6 p.m. Sunset that night was scheduled for 9 p.m., so Bella knew she had to keep a very brisk pace. She had a tight 3-hour window to get to the lake and back before the forest was plunged into total darkness. She found the animal trail and followed the stream. As she was walking, she suddenly heard the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up through the dense canopy of trees and saw that the sky was turning a dark, bruised purple. A major storm was rolling in. Instead of turning back and heading to the safety of her car, Bella decided she was too stubborn to give up on her hike. She was determined to reach the lake. So she began to jog along the stream to speed up her journey. Almost immediately, heavy raindrops began to fall, pattering against the leaves above. By the time she jogged past the spot where the headless beaver had been, she noticed the carcass was still lying there on the dirt, unmoved. The rain was starting to come down much harder now. 15 minutes after passing the beaver, she finally reached the junction of the river, and the storm officially unleashed a full downpour. Bella turned left at the river and started walking west toward the lake. But after only a minute or two, she stopped. She looked down at her watch. It was already past 8 p.m. She did some quick math in her head. Even if she turned around right this second, it would take her over an hour to get back to her car. Sunset was at 9 p.m., which meant that she was already guaranteed to be navigating the thick forest in the dark for at least the final portion of her hike. If she pushed all the way to the lake, she would be out in the dark for over an hour in a torrential downpour. She was already soaked to the skin, shivering from the cold, and the visibility was dropping fast. She realized that if she got lost in these woods in the dark during a massive storm, she could end up in a very dangerous situation. Reluctantly, Bella decided to turn back. She turned around and walked back along the riverbank to the junction where the stream met the river. She turned south and began the long walk back to her car. Because the storm had made the forest incredibly dark and the heavy rain was blurring her vision, Bella kept her head down. She focused entirely on the ground right in front of her feet, stepping carefully on the wet rocks and avoiding the slick, muddy patches of earth. The rain was pounding loudly all around her, drowning out almost every other sound. She had been walking south for about 15 minutes when, completely out of nowhere, something hard and wet slammed directly into the top of her head. Reflexively, Bella gasped, stumbled backward, and threw her hands up in front of her face to shield herself. She blinked away the rainwater and looked up to see what she had just run into. Dangling from a thick tree branch right above the center of the path was the beaver carcass. It was hanging by a rough cord wrapped around its hind legs. But it was not just hanging there. Someone had retrieved the severed head of the beaver and had very crudely stitched it onto the beaver's front paws so that the dead animal appeared to be holding its own head right in front of its chest. Bella had walked face first directly into it. Her immediate reaction was intense physical disgust. She began to gag, feeling like she was going to throw up right there on the path. She frantically rubbed at her hair and her forehead, terrified that decomposition fluids or blood from the dead animal had gotten on her skin. But as she was standing there, frantically wiping her head, a realization dawned on her that turned her blood cold. When she had passed this exact spot 30 minutes earlier on her way into the forest, the beaver carcass was still lying flat on the ground where it had been for the past week. She had seen it with her own eyes. Now, it was hanging from a tree branch directly over the path. This meant that someone had climbed this tree, strung up the beaver, and stitched its head to its paws within the last 30 minutes. And they had done it while she was just a short distance away up the trail. Bella's mind raced. Whoever did this had to be nearby. They might even be watching her right now. The forest was rapidly getting darker, and the rain was absolutely blinding. Bella began whipping her head around, staring desperately into the black trees, trying to spot a silhouette or some movement. But she could see nothing but the dark, twisting shapes of the forest. She was at least an hour's walk away from her car, and that was if she walked at a normal pace. Suddenly, she was gripped by a level of panic she had never experienced in her life. She forced herself to take a deep breath. She knew that if she started sprinting blindly through the dark, wet woods, she would likely trip, break an ankle, and get trapped. She had to stay calm and walk. She carefully navigated around the dangling beaver carcass and started walking south along the stream, but the moment she passed the hanging beaver, the hairs on the back of her neck stood straight up. Through the sound of the pouring rain, she heard a distinct rustling and cracking sound behind her. It could have been a deer, or it could have been the wind, but she was too terrified to turn around and check. She tried to tell herself she was just imagining things, but her legs refused to listen. She began to walk faster, then she transitioned into a jog, and within seconds, she was sprinting down the stream, splashing through the water and mud in a state of absolute terror. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, but eventually her lungs began to burn and she ran completely out of breath. About 5 or 6 minutes after passing the beaver, she came to a halt, bent over, and tried to catch her breath. She still had not looked behind her, and then, through the darkness and the roar of the rain, she heard it. It was the bell. It was the exact same sound she had heard the week before. It was that sporadic, erratic, metallic ringing. But this time, it was not off in the distance. It was close. In her panicked state, she could not tell exactly where it was coming from. It echoed off the trees, sounding like it was behind her, then off to the side. The darkness was now complete, and she was entirely blind to what was around her. Bella was now in a state of pure primal terror. There was someone in the dark watching her, chasing her, and ringing a bell. She forced her exhausted legs to start running again. She stumbled over slippery rocks, scratched her arms on branches she couldn't see, and fell several times into the mud, but she kept scrambling back up. As she ran, she pulled her iPhone out of her pocket and dialed her father's number. She pressed the phone to her ear, sobbing and gasping for air. Her father answered, and Bella could barely form a coherent sentence. She was wailing, screaming into the phone, begging him to come save her. She screamed, "Dad, please! Come to the forest! Meet me at the spot where the animal trail veers away from the stream! Please, there is someone chasing me in the dark and I can't see them!" Her father did not understand what was happening, but the sheer terror in his daughter's voice told him everything he needed to know. He didn't ask questions. He told her to stay on the line and said he was leaving right now. Bella's father and mother ran out of their house, jumped into their car, and sped down the mountain road. They pulled up right next to Bella's parked car on the shoulder. As they opened their car doors and stepped into the pouring rain, they could hear a sound echoing from deep within the dark forest. They could hear the distant, erratic chiming of a bell. They could also hear Bella screaming through the phone speaker, and the sound of the bell was coming through the phone line as well. She was begging them to hurry, crying out that she couldn't run anymore. The parents turned on their flashlights and charged directly into the dark woods, running up the stream as fast as they could. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Bella was completely exhausted. She had run out of energy and her legs felt like lead. As she struggled to move forward, the sound of the bell behind her was getting louder and louder. It was gaining on her at an alarming rate. She could hear the heavy thud of footsteps and the sound of branches snapping right behind her. Finally, when it felt like the bell was ringing right at the back of her head, Bella simply stopped. She realized she was too tired to keep running, and she was still 10 or 15 minutes away from the meeting spot. She knew she wasn't going to make it. She felt a sense of complete defeat. She felt she had no choice but to turn around and look at her pursuer. Terrified beyond words, shivering from the cold and the fear, Bella slowly turned around. She happened to be standing right at the edge of a small clearing in the trees. Because it was an open space, a tiny bit of moonlight managed to break through the storm clouds, illuminating a patch of ground about 50 feet wide. As Bella stared across this clearing, she initially saw nothing but shadows. Then, a tall, dark figure walked directly into the moonlight. As soon as the figure stepped into the light, Bella could see that it had a large bell tied to its waist. With every single step the figure took, it would violently shake its hips, causing the bell to ring out. The figure began moving across the clearing, straight toward her. Time seemed to slow down. Bella stared at the figure, but her brain could not process what she was looking at. The way this thing was moving was completely wrong. It didn't walk like a normal human being. Its steps were jerky, heavy, and bizarrely coordinated, almost like a large animal trying to walk upright, or someone with a severe physical deformity. But regardless of how it looked, it was coming straight for her. Suddenly, Bella was hit with a massive wave of adrenaline. Her survival instincts completely took over. She spun around and began sprinting faster than she ever had in her entire life. As she ran, all she could hear was the frantic, rapid ringing of the bell behind her. She knew the bell represented the steps the figure was taking, and the ringing was getting faster and louder. It was right on her heels. In a desperate bid to scare the attacker away, Bella began screaming at the top of her lungs, "I am on the phone with the police. They are right up ahead. They are going to be here any second." But the figure behind her did not care. It kept charging forward, relentless. Up ahead, her father had left his wife at the meeting spot and was charging up the stream alone, guided by his flashlight. He could hear his daughter's terrified screams and the frantic ringing of the bell. He ran toward the noise, and suddenly, his flashlight beam caught Bella as she burst out of the thick trees. She literally leaped through the air and threw herself into his arms. Her father grabbed her, tightly spun around, and ran back down the stream with her. He grabbed his wife at the meeting spot, and the three of them ran out of the forest, scrambled into their car, and slammed the door's lock. They sped away into the night, all of them crying and shaking. The parents kept repeating to each other, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell." The sound had confirmed their worst nightmare. There was something truly evil living in those woods. They drove straight to the local police station, where Bella filed a detailed report. Afterward, her parents took her to the hospital to get checked out. Fortunately, she only had some minor cuts and bruises from falling on the rocks, but physically she was going to be fine. The next morning, a large team of police officers went into the forest to investigate. They searched all along the stream and the animal path, but they found absolutely no trace of a tall figure or anyone living in the woods. Bella had told them she dropped her handbag during her flight, and she specified exactly where she had dropped it. But when police reached that spot, the bag was completely gone. Furthermore, when they reached the tree where the beaver had been hanging, they found nothing. The beaver carcass, the rope, and the stitches were gone. The only unusual thing the police found during their entire search was located a short distance off the path Bella had run down. Underneath a large flat rock, someone had neatly folded a clean t-shirt and placed it there. The police had no idea what it meant, and neither did Bella or her family. Ultimately, the police told the family that Bella had likely run into a mentally unstable squatter who was living in the forest. They suggested the person had seen Bella enter what they considered their territory and had orchestrated the entire thing simply to scare her away. But Bella has never been able to accept that explanation. She knew that if her father had not run into the woods and grabbed her when he did, she would have been caught. She felt in her bones that she was in mortal danger. And when she thinks back to the way that dark figure moved in the moonlight, she is convinced it was not a normal human being. Since that terrifying night in June of 2019, there have been no more reports of strange sightings or bells in those woods. But then again, almost no one ever goes into that forest besides Bella and her family. And they have never set foot in those woods again. Now we are going to travel back to August of 2005. 57-year-old Stephen Sleven was a physically healthy man, but mentally he was in a very dark place. He was suffering from severe depression, and he felt like his life had completely lost its purpose. He felt empty and hopeless. In an effort to escape his dark thoughts, Stephen decided to go on a spontaneous road trip. He didn't have a destination in mind, and he didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just felt that if he got behind the wheel of his car and drove somewhere, anywhere, he might start to feel better. But during his drive, Stephen began drinking alcohol to cope with his feelings. Before long, he was heavily intoxicated and swerving erratically across a New Mexico highway. A local police officer noticed his dangerous driving and pulled him over. Stephen failed his field sobriety tests, and the officer arrested him on suspicion of driving while intoxicated. Stephen was taken to the local county detention center to be booked. During the intake process, jail staff discovered that Stephen had a documented history of mental illness. Following the county's official policy for dealing with mentally unstable inmates, the officers decided to segregate Stephen from the rest of the jail's general population. They did this in an effort to protect Stephen from harming himself. They moved him into a heavily padded cell on the first floor. They stripped him of all of his clothes and put him in what is known as a suicide smock. A suicide smock is a heavy, thick, blanket-like garment that wraps tightly around an inmate's upper body. It keeps them warm and modest, but it is made of material that is impossible to tear or roll up, which prevents the inmate from creating a noose to harm themselves. After spending a few days in this padded cell, Stephen was moved to a slightly better cell. This new cell had a small window, a shower, and a toilet. Stephen was kept there for 2 weeks under strict medical observation by the jail staff. But at the end of those 2 weeks, for reasons that have never been fully explained or justified, jail officials made a decision that would change Stephen's life forever. They moved this mentally unstable, highly depressed man into solitary confinement to await his trial for the DWI charge. Solitary confinement is a form of imprisonment where an inmate is kept in a tiny, single-person cell for nearly 24 hours a day. They have absolutely no contact with other inmates, and their only human interaction is with guards who drop food through a slot in the door. The psychological damage caused by solitary confinement is well documented and absolutely devastating. Experts agree that just 15 days in total isolation is enough to cause permanent, irreversible psychological harm to a healthy person. For someone already struggling with severe depression, it is a death sentence for their sanity. For the first few weeks, Stephen actually managed to cope. He was allowed to write letters to his family, which allowed him to feel some connection to the outside world. He used the time to detox from the alcohol and reflect on his life. The guards noted that Stephen was incredibly polite and cooperative during his very limited interactions with them. Whenever he had a minor medical issue, instead of shouting or banging on the walls, Stephen would simply tap gently on the inside of his door and wait patiently for someone to acknowledge him. It often took hours for a guard to respond, but Stephen never got angry or frustrated. But by January of 2006, which was roughly 3 months into his solitary confinement, everything changed. Stephen had still not received any updates on when his trial was going to take place, and the prolonged isolation was starting to destroy his mind. He began suffering from intense panic attacks and vivid, terrifying hallucinations. He desperately wanted to know how much longer he was going to be kept in this tiny concrete box, but whenever he asked the guards, they ignored him. He tried to write letters to his family, begging them to contact a lawyer or get an update on his case. But when he sat down with a pen, his hand shook so violently from extreme anxiety and stress that he could not form legible words. Eventually, Stephen stopped trying to write. He began spending the vast majority of his days sitting in the far corner of his cell, pulling his knees tightly against his chest, and rocking back and forth for hours on end. In April of 2006, the jail staff stopped allowing Stephen to leave his cell for his occasional recreation walks. From that point on, he never left his cell at all. Because he was never let out, Stephen was unable to use the shower facilities. His physical hygiene completely deteriorated. Without the ability to bathe, a thick, painful fungus began to grow all over his skin, causing it to peel off in large patches. His teeth, which were neglected and uncleaned, began to rot in his mouth. Finally, on May 8, 2007, after spending 1 year and 8 months in continuous solitary confinement, Stephen was transferred to a behavioral health institute in Las Vegas, Nevada. At the institute, Stephen finally received basic human care. He was given a hot shower, his hair was cut, he was shaved, and doctors treated his physical and mental ailments. Within just a few days, Stephen was back to his normal, polite self. While he was there, he was finally given the opportunity to speak with a lawyer. The lawyer would later recall that during their very first meeting, Stephen was completely disoriented about the passage of time. He kept asking, "Where have I been? What happened to me?" The lawyer had to look him in the eye and say, "Stephen, you have been in solitary confinement waiting for your trial. You have been in that cell for almost 2 years. Stephen was completely shocked. He literally did not believe the lawyer. The trauma of the experience had been so severe that his brain had completely blocked out the memory of those 2 years to protect his sanity. But as the lawyer continued to talk, the memories slowly began to creep back into Stephen's mind. He began to shake, and he begged the lawyer not to let them send him back to that place. His lawyer told him that, unfortunately, since he was still technically awaiting trial for his DWI, the county had the legal right to send him back to the detention center once his evaluation at the institute was complete. The lawyer urged him to stay strong, promising that the trial had to be scheduled soon. Stephen stayed at the Behavioral Institute for only 2 weeks. During that time, he constantly asked the staff when his court date was, but no one had an answer. At the end of the 2 weeks, Stephen was abruptly taken from his room, placed in the back of a secure van, and driven right back to the detention center in New Mexico. The guards marched him straight back to his solitary confinement cell and pushed him inside. Stephen broke down, weeping and begging the guards not to lock him in there, but they ignored him and slammed the heavy steel door shut. Immediately, Stephen's mental state collapsed. A few days after his return, Stephen developed a massive, agonizing abscess in one of his rotting teeth. The pain was so intense that he couldn't sleep or eat. He knocked on the door, begging for a dentist or medical attention, but his pleas were ignored. One afternoon, unable to bear the excruciating pain any longer, Stephen sat in the corner of his cell. For 8 agonizing hours, he rocked back and forth, using his own fingers to violently twist, yank, and pull at the rotting tooth until he finally managed to rip it completely out of his gums. Finally, on June 22, 2007, Stephen's case was presented to a local judge. When the judge reviewed the files and realized that Stephen had been held in solitary confinement for nearly 2 years for a minor, first-time DWI charge without ever having a hearing, the judge was absolutely horrified. The judge immediately dismissed all charges against Stephen. 3 days later, Stephen Sleven walked out of the jail as a free man and was reunited with his family. He had been completely forgotten about by the system. Stephen filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the county. After a lengthy trial, the jury sided with Stephen and awarded him $15.5 million in damages for the unimaginable abuse and neglect he had suffered, but the victory was bittersweet. Around the exact same time the lawsuit was settled, Stephen was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and was told he had less than a year to live. It remains unclear if Stephen is still alive today, but his case remains one of the most shocking examples of institutional cruelty in American history. Now we are going to travel to Moscow, Russia. Moscow is well known for being one of the wealthiest cities on the planet. It is home to more billionaires than almost any other city in Europe. But if you travel just 10 miles south of Moscow's most affluent neighborhood, known as the Golden Mile, you will find yourself in a completely different world. You will reach the southern Moscow suburbs. Locals in Russia refer to this neighborhood by a very specific nickname, Jopomera, which literally translates to the hole of the world. Back during the era of the Soviet Union, these suburbs were actually a very clean, thriving, and desirable place to live. Tens of thousands of working-class Russian families lived there, and there were plenty of stable manufacturing jobs to go around, but after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the economy in this area completely disintegrated. The factories shut down, the money dried up, and the jobs vanished. The residents who lived there desperately wanted to move away to find better opportunities, but they didn't have the money or the resources to do so. They were completely trapped in a decaying neighborhood. In the decades since, nothing has improved. Today, Jopomera is still incredibly poor. Tens of thousands of families live packed inside massive, identical Soviet-era apartment buildings that are literally crumbling to pieces. Most of the residents are either chronically unemployed or they work menial, low-paying jobs that barely allow them to buy food. Because the local government is underfunded, the police force in the suburbs is highly corrupt and completely ineffective. As a result, violent crime, drug abuse, and severe alcoholism run rampant through the streets. But despite their miserable living conditions, the people of the southern Moscow suburbs did have one beautiful escape. Bitzviki Park. Bitzviki Park is a massive, lush green forest that sits right on the southern edge of the suburbs. It is a stunning natural oasis, filled with thick trees, beautiful winding streams, and quiet grassy clearings. In total, the park covers a whopping 2,700 acres, making it 3 times larger than New York City's Central Park. For the impoverished residents of the suburbs, Bitzviki Park was their absolute favorite place to go. They would take long walks through the woods, play intense games of chess with their friends on the concrete tables near the park's entrance, or go cross-country skiing in the freezing winter months. It was their one sanctuary from their incredibly bleak everyday lives, but in the early 2000s, that sanctuary turned into a place of absolute terror. Starting in May of 2001, people began to mysteriously vanish inside the heavily forested areas of Bitzviki Park. Between May and July of that year, 10 different men went missing. All of them had been seen alone right before they disappeared. When these men did not return home after several days, their terrified families went to the local police to report them missing. But because the police were corrupt and lazy, they refused to launch any kind of investigation. Instead, they told the families that their missing relatives were probably just drunk bums who had wandered off to escape their responsibilities, and that whatever trouble they had gotten into was their own fault. The families knew this was not true, but there was nothing they could do. They had no choice but to grieve in silence. By the end of 2001, 5 more men vanished under the exact same circumstances, bringing the total number of missing people to 15. Once again, the police did absolutely nothing, and the public eventually grew numb to the disappearances. Assuming that life in Jopomera was simply harsh and people sometimes disappeared, this terrifying pattern continued for nearly 4 years. Between 2002 and late 2005, 25 more people vanished inside Bitzviki Park. 24 of them were men and 1 was a woman. This brought the total number of mysterious disappearances inside the forest to 40. Yet, the police continued to ignore the situation, but everything changed with missing person number 41. Nikolai Zakharenko was a 63-year-old retired police officer who lived in a tiny apartment in the suburbs. He was a tough, old-school Russian guy who chain-smoked cigarettes and drank vodka. He was well aware of the rumors surrounding the park, but he was a proud man who refused to let fear dictate his life. He loved going for long walks in the woods, and he was confident he could handle himself against any threat. One evening in November of 2005, Nikolai told his sister he was going out for a quick walk in the park, but he never came back. The following morning, his worried family went to the police. As usual, the police dismissed their concerns, but a few days later, a local resident was walking deep in the forest of Bitzviki Park when they noticed a strange, dark shape hidden in the thick underbrush off the main trail. The resident had a terrible feeling about it and called the police. This time, because the report came from a citizen who had physically spotted something, officers actually went out to investigate. When they pushed through the underbrush, they found the body of Nikolai Zakharenko. He was lying face down on the forest floor. He was fully clothed, but he had suffered a horrific, fatal injury. There was a massive, jagged hole in the back of his head. It was immediately clear this was not a gunshot wound. Nikolai had been struck from behind with massive blunt force trauma. The blow had been so incredibly powerful that the back half of his skull had been completely shattered and blown off. The police searched the immediate area for a murder weapon or any footprints, but the forest floor was covered in thick pine needles and they found nothing. Now that they had a physical body that was clearly the victim of a brutal murder, the police could no longer ignore the 40 other people who had gone missing in the park. They realized they were likely dealing with a highly prolific serial killer, and that there were probably more bodies hidden in the vast forest. The local police called in elite homicide detectives from Russia's Criminal Investigation Department. Together, a massive force of officers began a meticulous grid search of every single acre of Bitzviki Park. They spent weeks searching the dense woods, but unbelievably, they found absolutely nothing. As news of Nikolai's brutal murder spread through the suburbs, the local residents were gripped by absolute panic. Before, the disappearances had felt distant and theoretical, but now, knowing that a retired police officer had been savagely slaughtered in the woods, the danger felt incredibly real. Almost overnight, the park emptied out. Parents forbade their children from playing near the trees, and neighbors warned each other to stay far away from the forest. The locals began to refer to the unseen monster lurking in the woods as the Bitzviki Park maniac. But despite the fact that the park was now deserted, and despite the heavy police patrols that were constantly moving through the trees, the disappearances did not stop. Between November of 2005 and April of 2006, 9 more men vanished in the forest, and just like Nikolai, their bodies were discovered a few days later lying in the underbrush with the backs of their skulls completely caved in. But the killer had added a terrifying new signature to these crimes. Almost all of these 9 new victims were found with a broken glass vodka bottle jammed directly into the wound in the back of their heads. This macabre detail confirmed that the killer was a human being who was taking a sick, sadistic pleasure in his crimes. By this point, the park was a complete ghost town. Only the most stubborn, reckless people dared to enter. And one of those people was 32-year-old Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander had lived in the southern Moscow suburbs his entire life, sharing a cramped, tiny apartment with his mother. His childhood had been incredibly difficult. When he was just 4 years old, he had been playing on a playground when he fell backward off a swing. As he sat up, the heavy wooden swing came rushing back and struck him directly in the forehead, causing severe brain damage. His family was incredibly poor and could not afford to take him to a hospital. Because he was able to stand up and walk, they assumed he was fine. But the injury had permanently damaged his frontal lobe, impairing his cognitive abilities. When Alexander went to school, he struggled to learn. He spoke with a slight slur and had difficulty processing information, which made him an easy target for cruel bullies. He grew up feeling completely isolated, lonely, and angry at the world. But when Alexander was a young teenager, his grandfather noticed how miserable he was and decided to help him. His grandfather brought him to his apartment and taught him how to play chess. The moment Alexander learned the rules of chess, it was as if a hidden, brilliant portion of his damaged brain suddenly unlocked. He was a natural prodigy. Within days, he was easily defeating his grandfather. Excited by his grandson's talent, the grandfather brought Alexander down to Bitzviki Park, where the neighborhood's older men gathered daily to play chess on the concrete park tables. These men were seasoned players, but Alexander absolutely destroyed them. The older men were amazed by the young boy's brilliance. They welcomed him into their community, treated him with immense respect, and protected him from bullies. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt valued and happy. Bitzviki Park became his sanctuary. Even after his grandfather passed away, Alexander continued to go to the park to play chess almost every single day. He kept going even when his fellow chess players began to mysteriously disappear. His terrified mother begged him to stay home, but Alexander would simply smile and say, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll be fine." In April of 2006, Alexander was 32 years old and working as a clerk stocking shelves at a local grocery store. By this time, over 50 people had vanished in the park and 10 bodies had been found. On the morning of April 12th, Alexander arrived at work and noticed a new female employee. Her name was Larissa Kagina, and she was 48 years old. Alexander was highly socially awkward and had never had a girlfriend, but he found Larissa incredibly beautiful and gentle. He spent his entire shift building up his courage. At the end of the day, as they both walked out of the store, he noticed Larissa was looking through her bag for a lighter to light her cigarette. Alexander quickly stepped forward, pulled out his lighter, and offered her a light. They began walking together, chatting and smoking. Larissa lived near Alexander's apartment, and as they arrived outside her building, Alexander felt a sudden wave of boldness. He asked her if she wanted to keep walking and perhaps take a stroll through Bitzviki Park. Normally, no one in their right mind would agree to go to the park, especially with a quiet, awkward man. But Larissa enjoyed Alexander's company, and she agreed. They walked across the street and entered the park. They passed the concrete chess tables, which were completely empty. They kept walking, entering the dense forest as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows through the trees. They walked deep into the woods, eventually leaving the paved path and stepping over fallen logs and pushing through thick branches. As they got deeper into the darkness, Larissa suddenly stopped walking. Alexander turned around to face her. In the dim light, he could see that the cheerful expression on her face had completely vanished. She looked exhausted, terrified, and incredibly sad. Suddenly, Larissa collapsed against a nearby tree, wrapping her arms around the trunk, and slid down to the damp ground. She began to weep uncontrollably. Alexander stood there silently watching her. After a few moments, Larissa looked up at him through her tears and whispered, "You're the maniac, aren't you?" Alexander was stunned. None of his previous victims had ever figured it out on their own. He smiled a cold, chilling smile and replied, "Yes, I am." Larissa let out a heartbreaking sob and asked, "Are you going to kill me?" Without a shred of hesitation, Alexander looked down at her and said, "Yes, I am." Then, he reached into his heavy jacket and pulled out a hammer. The truth about Alexander Pichushkin was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. He was indeed the Bitzviki Park maniac. His urge to kill had actually started back in 1992 when he was just 18 years old. He had become completely obsessed with the idea of taking a human life. He confided this dark desire to his high school classmate, Mikhaila Odachuk. Surprisingly, Mikhaila admitted that he also wanted to experience what it felt like to kill someone. The two teenagers agreed to commit a murder together. They went to Bitzviki Park and began walking through the dense forest, searching for a vulnerable, lone victim. But as they walked, Mikhail began to get cold feet. He started shaking and told Alexander that he wanted to go home and maybe try again another day. Alexander became furious. He realized Mikhail was weak and could not be trusted. So he decided that Mikhail would be his very first victim. Alexander smiled and told Mikhail that it was fine if he wanted to go home. Relieved, Mikhail turned around to walk back to the entrance. The moment his back was turned, Alexander pulled a heavy hammer from his bag and smashed it violently into the back of Mikhail's head. Mikhail collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Alexander remembered that they had passed a hidden sewer access well a few moments earlier. He grabbed Mikhail's limp body and dragged him through the undergrowth to the well. He pulled off the heavy metal lid. This well was not for drinking water. It was an entry point to a massive underground storm drain and sewer system that ran beneath the entire park. The shaft dropped straight down for 30 feet. Alexander lifted Mikhail's body and dumped him headfirst into the dark shaft, listening to the heavy splash as he hit the freezing water below. Then he replaced the lid and walked away. Whether Mikhail died from the hammer blow or drowned in the dark sewer, no one knows. The rushing water inside the sewer system swept his body miles away, deep underground where it was never found. Alexander was so terrified of being caught after his first murder that he did not kill again for 9 years. But in 2001, his urge returned with a vengeance. His second victim was one of his older chess friends from the park. After a game of chess, Alexander invited the man into the forest to help him pay respects to his beloved dog, which he claimed had died and been buried near a specific well. The friend, who trusted Alexander completely, agreed to go. They walked deep into the woods to the well. Alexander pulled out a bottle of vodka, took a drink, and handed it to his friend to toast the dead dog. As the friend turned around to walk back, Alexander struck him in the back of the head with his hammer and dumped his body down the same sewer well. Over the next 4 years, Alexander used this exact same method to murder dozens of people. Almost all of his victims were people he knew personally, his chess partners, his neighbors, and coworkers. He loved the feeling of killing people who trusted him, claiming it made him feel like a god who held the power of life and death over his acquaintances. But amazingly, 2 of his victims actually survived. A pregnant woman and a 13-year-old boy were both struck by Alexander and thrown down the sewer well. But as they fell, their clothing snagged on metal pipes inside the shaft, breaking their fall. After Alexander left, both victims managed to regain consciousness, climb up the 30-foot shaft, and escape. Both of them went straight to the police and gave them Alexander's name. But because the local police were incredibly corrupt and did not want to deal with the paperwork of a complicated investigation, they literally threatened the victims. They told them that if they didn't drop the accusations, the police would frame them for crimes and throw them in jail. Because of this shocking police corruption, Alexander was allowed to keep killing for years. In April of 2006, Alexander murdered Larissa Kigina with his hammer and left her body in the woods. 2 months later, he targeted another female co-worker named Marina. But before Marina left her apartment to go for a walk with Alexander, she left a detailed note on her kitchen table for her teenage son. The note stated exactly who she was going to the park with, and she wrote down Alexander's full name and phone number. Alexander knew about the note, but his desire for fame had become so overwhelming that he decided to kill her anyway. He was tired of being a shadow in the woods. He wanted the world to know what he had accomplished. Shortly after Marina's body was found, police discovered the note and arrested Alexander at his apartment. When detectives searched his home, they found a notebook containing a drawing of a chessboard. The board had 64 squares, and 62 of those squares had been meticulously filled in with dates and names. Alexander proudly explained to the horrified detectives that this was his scorecard. He had wanted to kill 64 people to fill every square on the board. He claimed he had successfully murdered 62 people, though 2 had survived. Ultimately, prosecutors were only able to find enough physical evidence to charge him with 49 murders. When Alexander heard this in court, he was deeply upset and actually argued with the judge, demanding that he be credited with all 62 victims so he could maintain his record. During his highly publicized trial, Alexander was kept inside a secure glass cage because he was deemed too dangerous to be near anyone. He laughed, smirked, and showed absolutely no remorse for his horrific crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge ordered that the first 15 years of his sentence be served in absolute total solitary confinement. Today, Alexander Pichushkin remains locked in a tiny dark cell in a maximum security Siberian prison, completely isolated from the rest of humanity. Now, we are going to travel to January of 2007 in Sacramento, California. A few months earlier, in November of 2006, Nintendo had released its highly anticipated new video game console, the Nintendo Wii. The console was an absolute global phenomenon, and it sold out worldwide almost instantly. By January of 2007, stores were still completely out of stock, and people were growing increasingly desperate to get their hands on one for their children. A popular Sacramento radio station called KDND, broadcasting on 100.7 FM, managed to purchase one of these rare consoles. They decided to use it as the grand prize for a highly controversial on-air contest. The contest was given a crude, catchy name, Hold Your Wii for a Wii. The rules of the contest were incredibly simple. The contestants would be brought into the radio studio and given large amounts of water to drink at regular intervals. The person who could go the longest without urinating or vomiting would win the coveted Nintendo Wii. In the days leading up to the event, several concerned listeners and medical professionals called into the radio station to warn the DJs that forcing people to drink massive quantities of water without urinating could be incredibly dangerous and even fatal. But the radio hosts publicly laughed off these warnings on the air. They claimed they were fully aware of the risks and that all contestants would be required to sign a liability waiver, meaning the station would not be held responsible for any health issues. On the morning of Friday, January 12, 2007, 18 contestants arrived at the radio station. Among them was 28-year-old Jennifer Strange. Jennifer was a loving mother of 3 young children, and she was determined to win the console as a special surprise for her kids. After signing the waivers, the contestants were ushered into a small room inside the studio. They were handed 8-ounce bottles of water and told they had to completely finish one bottle every 15 minutes. If anyone failed to finish their bottle in time, or if they left the room to use the restroom, they would be immediately disqualified. By 8 a.m., after the contestants had consumed 5 bottles of water, several of them began to drop out because the physical pain in their bladders was becoming unbearable. Seeing that the contest was moving too slowly, the radio staff decided to speed things up. They handed the remaining contestants, including Jennifer, much larger 16-ounce bottles of water and told them to keep drinking at the same 15-minute intervals. Over the next few hours, almost all of the remaining contestants dropped out. The physical pressure was simply too agonizing. Eventually, only Jennifer and one other contestant were left. Jennifer was in visible distress. She was recorded on the live broadcast saying that her head felt like it was going to explode and that she was in excruciating pain. Instead of showing concern, one of the radio hosts laughed and joked about her discomfort, asking if she needed to lay down, while another host pointed out that she was shaking so badly she could barely walk. During the live broadcast, a registered nurse called into the station's hotline. She spoke directly to the hosts, telling them in a very serious tone that what they were doing was incredibly dangerous. She explained that they were putting the contestants at risk of water intoxication, also known as water poisoning. Water poisoning occurs when an excessive amount of water is consumed in a short period, which severely dilutes the sodium levels in the bloodstream. This causes water to rush into the brain cells, leading to massive brain swelling, seizures, comas, and eventually death. But the arrogant host dismissed the nurse's warning. He turned to the microphone and shouted to the studio, "Hey, is anyone dying out there?" When the remaining contestants didn't answer, the host laughed, mocked the nurse, and hung up on her. A short time later, the hosts commented on the air that Jennifer's stomach had become shockingly bloated and distended, joking that she looked like she was pregnant. Shortly after, both Jennifer and the other contestant began to physically vomit because their bodies were desperately trying to reject the water. But because they wanted the prize so badly, they refused to quit. Finally, the pain became too much for Jennifer to survive. She officially dropped out of the contest and ran to the bathroom to relieve herself. Because she had finished in second place, she was awarded tickets to a Justin Timberlake concert. Jennifer left the station and got into her car to drive home. But during the drive, she was hit with a blinding, horrific headache. She was crying so hard from the pain that she could barely see the road. She managed to pull over and call one of her coworkers, sobbing into the phone, and explaining that she was in too much pain to come into work that day. Her coworker was deeply concerned by how sick Jennifer sounded and immediately called Jennifer's mother, urging her to go check on her daughter. About an hour later, Jennifer's mother arrived at Jennifer's house. She walked inside and called out her daughter's name, but there was no response. She walked through the house and eventually opened the bathroom door. There, she found her 28-year-old daughter lying dead on the bathroom floor. The official autopsy confirmed that Jennifer Strange had died from acute water intoxication. The public outrage following Jennifer's tragic and completely preventable death was massive. The radio station fired all of the DJs and staff members who were involved in organizing and hosting the contest, and the federal government eventually launched an investigation into the station's license. Jennifer's devastated family filed a massive wrongful death lawsuit against the radio station's parent company. During the trial, the jury was shown the raw audio of the broadcast, where the hosts openly mocked the medical warnings and laughed at Jennifer's visible suffering. The jury found the media company completely liable for Jennifer's death and ordered them to pay her family over $16 million in damages. But no amount of money could ever bring back a loving mother who had simply wanted to win a toy to bring joy to her children. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.